June 6, 1944. 10:15 a.m. La Roche-Guyon, France. The staff car rolls through the gates. Dust settles on polished boots. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel steps onto gravel, still carrying the small wrapped gift he never got to present. The chateau is quiet. Too quiet. No officers at attention, no orderly routine. Just a radio crackling from the operations room, voices overlapping in static bursts. He moves toward the door. Light cuts through smoke. A map spread across the table, red markers bleeding across the Normandy coast like arterial spray. They thought the wall would hold, but what he saw in that room changed everything. The air inside smells of cigarettes and cold coffee. Papers scattered. Telephones off their hooks. An officer stands frozen by the window, staring west toward the channel. Another paces, hands clasped behind his back. Boots tapping Morse code on stone floor. Rommel removes his cap. His fingers trace the edge of the map table. The fabric feels real. The ink feels real. But the numbers, they feel like fiction. Outside, birdsong. Inside, the low hum of a radio receiver cycling through frequencies. A clock ticks on the mantel. Someone coughs. No one speaks. He has been here before. North Africa. The taste of sand and defeat. The slow recognition that logistics matter more than courage. That fuel matters more than will. That air superiority decides battles before the first shot. But this is France. This is the Atlantic Wall. This was supposed to be different. He looks at the map again. It is not different. For 18 months, Rommel had believed in the wall. From Dunkirk to Biarritz, 1,700 miles of fortifications, 60 divisions, 5 million mines. Concrete bunkers sunk into cliffs, artillery positions calibrated to the meter. Beach obstacles, Rommel's asparagus, angled to tear open landing craft at high tide. Inland, flooded fields to drown paratroopers. Every approach calculated, every vector defended. He had walked those beaches himself, notebook in hand, sketching fields of fire, measuring gradients, placing gun emplacements with the precision of a watchmaker. He told his engineers, the enemy must be destroyed in the water. Not one man reaches the beach alive. By May 1944, he believed it. So did Berlin. Intelligence confirmed it. The Allies would strike at Calais, the shortest crossing. Fortifications there were tripled. Panzer divisions positioned within striking distance. Reconnaissance reported no major fleet movements toward Normandy. Luftwaffe photo analysts saw nothing unusual. Abwehr agents in England sent assurances. Normandy was a diversion. Rommel requested leave. His wife's birthday, June 6th, in Ulm. He would be gone 48 hours. The weather was atrocious. Storms in the channel, low clouds, high seas. No invasion force would sail into that. General Speidel agreed. So did von Rundstedt. On June 5th, Rommel drove east. The roads were empty. The radar was quiet. The Atlantic Wall stood ready. The illusion was complete. He arrives back at 10:15 a.m. The first reports came in at 02:00 a.m. 02:10 hours, airborne contacts over the Cotentin Peninsula. Hundreds. Radar stations report mass formations, assumed to be diversionary. 0300 hours, paratrooper drops confirmed. 82nd and 101st Airborne. Not near Calais. Normandy. Sainte-Mère-Église occupied. Germans still waiting for the real invasion. 0450 hours, radio intercept. Utah, Omaha, Gold Juno Sword. 5 landing zones, not 1. 5. 0630 hours, naval bombardment begins. Not probing fire, saturation fire, 16-inch shells from battleships. Cruisers, destroyers, rocket ships. The entire channel horizon is fire. 06:35 hours, landing craft spotted. Thousands. Spotter planes report, invasion fleet extends beyond visible horizon. Rommel listens. The officer reads from teletype report, voice flat, mechanical. 84th Corps reports enemy established at Utah Beach. Casualties heavy. Requesting immediate panzer support. 716th Infantry Division reports Juneau Beach overrun. Strongpoint WN-27 destroyed. Radio contact lost with coastal batteries. Omaha Beach holding. American forces pinned, but reinforcements landing continuously. Gold Beach, British armor advancing inland. Bayou threatened. Sword Beach, commandos moving toward Caen. Bridgehead secure. Rommel's jaw tightens. Where are the panzers? Still at Calais, Herr Feldmarschall. OKW has not released them. And the Luftwaffe? Silence. Then, 12 sorties this morning. 12. The Allies have flown over 3,000. He walks to the window. The sky is gray, empty. No German fighters, no bombers, no reconnaissance, just clouds. And beyond them, Allied aircraft circling like hawks. The officer continues. RAF and USAAF conducting interdiction missions. All rail lines north of Loire destroyed. Bridges down. Roads cratered. Reinforcements cannot move. German radar knocked out by electronic jamming. Operators report snow. Systems blinded. Allied naval guns firing with real-time spotter correction. Every battery that revealed its position was destroyed within minutes. French resistance cutting telephone lines. Sabotage widespread. Command network fragmenting. Rommel turns from the window. What about the counterattack? There is no counterattack, sir. 21st Panzer is engaged piecemeal. 12th SS Panzer cannot move without Führer authorization. Authorization has not come. Another teletype clicks. Another officer tears the paper free, reads, American engineers clearing beach obstacles under fire. Ports being improvised. They are not retreating. They are building. Rommel stares at the map. Red ink spreading. Blue arrows pushing inland. Numbers scrolling in his mind. 5 beaches. 50,000 men ashore by noon. 100,000 by nightfall. Supplies, armor, artillery, flowing. And his wall, his perfect wall, bypassed, isolated, irrelevant. The data is clear. The data is brutal. The data does not lie. He lifts a hand, presses fingertips to the map. Normandy, not Calais. Never Calais. The entire strategic assumption wrong. Rommel stands alone now. The others have left to coordinate, to send orders, to perform the rituals of command. But command has already slipped away. He leans over the map. Red marks cluster like infection, each one a beach-strong point that reported contact, then went silent. Each silence 100 men, his men, overrun or dead. His finger traces the coast, Grand Camp, Vierville, Colleville, Saint-Aubin. Names on maps, graves now. The room is dim, afternoon light filters through stone mullions, pale and cold. Dust motes drift. The clock ticks. Somewhere distant, a telephone rings unanswered. He thinks of the morning, driving through Ulm, the gift for Lucy, breakfast in sunlight. A world that felt solid, a war that felt winnable. Hours ago, a lifetime ago. He had fought in deserts. He knew what defeat tasted like. Tobruk, El Alamein. The slow realization that supply lines matter more than tactics, that fuel beats courage, that air dominance decides everything before infantry even moves. But this is different. This is not a battle lost. This is a war lost. The Allies are not just landing, they are staying. And they are staying because they own three dimensions Rommel cannot touch: the sky, the sea, and the truth. The sky, where Luftwaffe once ruled, now a graveyard. Where every movement by day brings instant retribution. Where German columns cannot march without being spotted, targeted, destroyed. The sea, an endless conveyor of men and steel. Not a raid, not a gamble. A pipeline, sustainable, industrial. And the truth, that every assumption Berlin made, every intelligence brief, every strategic assessment was smoke. Calais was a ghost. Normandy was real. And Rommel, the desert fox, the master of maneuver, was not outfought. He was outthought. He places both palms flat on the map, feels the paper under skin. It is not paper. It is France. And France is being taken from him meter by meter while he stands in a chateau, powerless. Because the tools he needs, panzer divisions, air cover, fuel, reinforcements, are not his to command. They belong to Hitler. And Hitler is asleep in Berchtesgaden, surrounded by men who do not understand what Rommel understands now. This is not 1940. The enemy is not the same. The war is not the same. He looks at the clock. 14 to 30 hours. 8 hours since the first landing craft touched sand. 8 hours, and the beachheads are linked. The wall is breached. The door is open. And there is no second wall. No fallback line prepared. No strategic depth. No reserve plan for this scenario because this scenario was not supposed to happen. Rommel exhales slowly. His hands slide off the map, fall to his sides. He knows it then. Not might be lost. Was lost? Not today. Not this week. But the war. The trajectory is set. The physics of it. Industrial output, resource flow, technological dominance, irreversible. A man in a room. A map on a table. Silence. The failure was not built in June. It was built in years. Rommel did not know it, but the war he thought he was fighting had ended months before D-Day. The real war, the one that mattered, was being waged in frequencies he could not hear, in rooms he could not enter, in decisions made by men he would never meet. Operation Fortitude. While Rommel inspected bunkers, Allied intelligence was constructing an army that did not exist. Fake radio traffic, dummy tanks inflatable, arranged in fields across Kent. Entire divisions, fictional, transmitting orders, requisitioning supplies, complaining about weather. German listening posts recorded it all. Abwehr analysts compiled reports. The 1st U.S. Army Group under Patton, 150,000 men, preparing to strike Calais. It was all theater. Every transmission scripted, every leak intentional. And the Abwehr believed it. Because the Abwehr had been compromised. The double-cross system. Every German agent in Britain, captured, every single one, turned or replaced. For 3 years, they sent reports to Berlin, accurate enough to be trusted, false enough to deceive. They confirmed Calais. They dismissed Normandy. They reported Patton's fictitious army assembling. They fed the illusion, and the illusion fed German strategy. Rommel's wall was built on sand. Not the sand of Normandy beaches, but the sand of corrupted intelligence. He fortified the wrong coast because he was told to fortify the wrong coast. And he was told by sources Berlin trusted absolutely. Sources that were, by 1944, wholly controlled by the enemy. But intelligence was only one dimension: strategic bombing. The Allies did not just deceive, they crippled. For 2 years, British and American bombers systematically destroyed the infrastructure of German response. Rail yards, fuel depots, aircraft factories, bridges, every night, the RAF, every day, the USAAF, not random, targeted. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe had planes but no fuel. Panzer divisions had tanks but no transport. Communication relied on telephone lines the resistance cut nightly. The machinery of counterattack rusted, starved, blinded. Rommel had built fortifications. But fortifications need reinforcement, and reinforcement needs mobility, and mobility was gone. Command structure. And then the final mechanism, paralysis by design. Hitler controlled everything. Panzer reserves could not move without his personal authorization. Artillery redeployment required approval from OKW. Even tactical withdrawals needed Berlin's consent. The command chain was not a chain. It was a noose. On the night of June 5th, when the first intelligence of airborne drops came in, junior officers requested permission to wake the Führer. Denied. He had taken sleeping pills. No one would disturb him. So the 12th SS Panzer Division, the closest armored unit to Normandy, sat idle. Engines cold. Commanders waiting for a phone call from a man who would not wake until noon. By the time authorization came, Allied fighter bombers owned the roads. The division moved 20 kilometers in 12 hours under constant attack. What should have been a spearhead became a funeral procession. Rommel understood then. The mechanisms of defeat were structural. Not bad luck, not poor execution. The system itself was designed to fail. Centralized command, corrupted intelligence, severed logistics, air inferiority. No fieldcraft could overcome that. No tactical brilliance, no wall, no matter how thick. He was fighting the war Germany could see. The Allies were fighting the war Germany could not. 3 weeks later, Rommel writes to Hitler. The letter is careful, factual, clinical. He describes Allied material superiority, air dominance, the impossibility of maneuver. He does not use the word defeat, but the meaning is clear. The letter is ignored. July 17th, 1944. Rommel's staff car is strafed by British Typhoon fighters on a road near Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. The driver is killed. Rommel suffers a fractured skull, severe concussion. He is pulled from the wreckage, unconscious. He never returns to command. October 14th, 1944. 2 officers arrive at his home in Herrlingen. They carry a message from Berlin. He is implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. The evidence is circumstantial, the accusations thin. But the sentence is absolute. They offer a choice: public trial, disgrace, family persecution, or suicide, state funeral, family protected. Rommel chooses the cyanide capsule. At 1 p.m., he says goodbye to his wife and son. At 1:25 p.m., he is dead. The official cause, heart attack following combat injuries. The Reich gives him a hero's burial. The truth stays buried for years. Normandy became a bridgehead. The bridgehead became a breakout. By August, Paris was liberated. By winter, the Allies were at the Rhine. The Atlantic Wall, that monument to concrete and certainty, crumbled not because it was weak, but because it was obsolete. Wars are no longer won by walls. They are won by systems, by intelligence networks, industrial output, technological reach, and the ability to see the battlefield entire. Rommel spent his life mastering the art of maneuver. But by 1944, maneuver was irrelevant. The Allies did not outfight him. They outplanned him, outproduced him, outthought him. He was the last great practitioner of a warfare that no longer existed. And perhaps that is the truest tragedy. Not that he lost, but that he never had the chance to win. The war was decided in factories in Detroit, code-breaking rooms in Bletchley Park, bomber streams over Hamburg, long before the first landing craft touched Omaha Beach. Rommel knew this at the end. Standing in that room, staring at that map. In war, even perfect defenses mean nothing if you are defending the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong understanding of what war has become. February 15th, 1942. Singapore. The air smelled of burning oil and wet concrete. In a command room thick with smoke, British officers stood around a map of Malaya, red circles spreading south like blood through water. Outside, the sound of artillery had stopped. That silence was worse than the guns. For 200 years, the British Empire had never surrendered an entire army. Not in this scale. Not to an Asian power. But on that Sunday morning, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival walked into a factory building carrying a white flag. 80,000 men, the largest capitulation in British military history. They thought Singapore was impregnable. They were wrong. The fortress had been called the Gibraltar of the East. 15-inch naval guns pointed out to sea. Bunkers, barbed wire, ammunition depots carved into rock. For 20 years, British strategists said the same thing. Singapore cannot fall. The planners had designed it perfectly for an enemy coming from the ocean. But the Japanese came through the jungle. In the final days, you could hear it in the streets. The low rumble of approaching tanks, the crackling of fires in the Chinese quarter. Water rationing had begun. The hospitals overflowed. Civilians pressed against the docks, trying to board the last ships out. And in the command bunkers, officers stared at reports they couldn't believe. How had 30,000 Japanese soldiers, many on bicycles, pushed back an army nearly 3 times their size? How had the impregnable fortress lasted only 7 days? The answers were already there. They just hadn't wanted to see them. It had started with confidence. Certainty, even. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, British command in Singapore issued calm reassurances. The Japanese were inferior, poorly equipped. Their planes were copies, their tanks obsolete. Their soldiers, though numerous, lacked the discipline and tactical training of European forces. Churchill himself had called Singapore a fortress. The Royal Navy had sent the HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, 2 of Britain's most powerful warships, to intimidate any Japanese advance. On December 10th, both ships were sunk by Japanese aircraft off the Malayan coast. 90 minutes. That's how long it took. But even then, the illusion held. Singapore still had 80,000 defenders. The Japanese, intelligence said, had barely 30,000 troops moving south through Malaya. Surely the jungle would slow them. Surely the rivers would stop them. Surely. The Japanese moved faster than anyone predicted. They captured British airfields. They used bicycles to move through terrain the British said was impassable. They outflanked defensive lines. They struck at night. They didn't follow European rules of warfare. And every day, the red circles on the map moved closer to Singapore. By early February, they had reached the Johor Strait, the narrow channel separating Malaya from Singapore Island. The last barrier, 1 kilometer of water. It should have been enough. The numbers told a story no one wanted to read. Water supply. Singapore's reservoirs on the island held enough for 1 million people. But the pipes bringing water from Johor on the mainland had been cut when the British demolished the causeway. Daily consumption, 17 million gallons. Daily production from island reservoirs, barely 12 million. Time until rationing became critical, 4 days. Ammunition, the 15-inch coastal guns, Singapore's pride, were designed to fire at ships. Most of their shells were armor-piercing rounds, meant to penetrate battleship hulls. Against infantry and land targets, they were nearly useless. The guns couldn't even depress low enough to hit targets across the strait. Anti-aircraft ammunition, dwindling. Small arms ammunition, sufficient but scattered. Artillery shells for land defense, critically low. Air power. At the start of the Malayan campaign, the RAF had 158 aircraft in the region. By February 10th, fewer than 30 remained operational. The Japanese had air superiority, unchallenged. Troop disposition, 80,000 defenders sounds overwhelming. But the perimeter of Singapore Island stretches 70 miles. That's roughly 100 men per mile, if evenly distributed. They weren't. Most British and Australian units were positioned on the southern coast, still expecting a naval assault. The northwest, where the Japanese actually crossed, was defended primarily by inexperienced Indian and Malay units, some of whom had received only weeks of training. When the Japanese crossed the Johor Strait on the night of February 8th, they landed on the weakest point in the line. Command structure. Lieutenant General Percival had taken command in May 1941. He inherited a defensive plan based on outdated assumptions. He requested reinforcements. London sent 2 inexperienced Indian brigades and an understrength British division, the 18th, fresh off the boat, never trained for jungle warfare. Percival had no tanks. The terrain, he was told, wasn't suitable. The Japanese used tanks. Intelligence failure. British intelligence estimated Japanese strength at 30,000. Actual strength, 36,000. But more important than the numbers was the misunderstanding of capability. The British assumed the Japanese would need overwhelming superiority to attack. The Japanese didn't. They moved at night. They infiltrated. They used speed and confusion as weapons. They didn't wait for supply lines to catch up. They lived off captured stocks, off the land, off momentum. While British officers waited for clear intelligence and proper supply, the Japanese attacked. Civilian situation. 1 million civilians crowded the island. Food stocks were calculated for a siege lasting months. But no one had planned for mass panic. Looting began on February 13th. Fires burned across the city. Hospitals had no room for wounded soldiers. The fortress was not built to protect a city full of refugees. It was built to intimidate an enemy that would never come by sea. February 13th, 1942, 9 a.m. Percival sat in his command post at Fort Canning, reading reports that all said the same thing in different words. The northwestern front had collapsed. Japanese forces were now fighting in the suburbs. The water reservoirs at Bukit Timah had fallen. Ammunition dumps were burning. He looked at the map. The red was everywhere now. His chief engineer handed him a typed memo. 2 sentences. Water supply to the city will fail within 24 hours. Reserves insufficient for military and civilian needs. Percival read it twice. Then he asked a question he already knew the answer to. Can we counterattack? The room went quiet. His staff officers looked at each other. One finally spoke. With what, sir? The Australian 22nd Brigade was shattered. The Indian divisions had broken. The British 18th had been in combat for less than a week and lost a third of their strength. There were no reserves, no fresh troops, no tanks, no air cover, and no water. Percival realized something in that moment, something that would haunt British strategic thinking for the next decade. This wasn't a battle he had lost. It was a battle that couldn't be won, not because of cowardice, not because of poor tactics, but because the entire premise, the fortifications, the guns, the strategy, the confidence, had been built on an assumption that was wrong. Singapore was impregnable from the sea. The Japanese had never planned to come from the sea. Across the island, the illusion shattered in smaller moments. An Australian sergeant watched Japanese tanks roll through a rubber plantation his officers swore was impassable terrain. A British pilot, grounded for lack of fuel, stood on the airfield and watched Japanese Zeros strafe the docks unopposed. A nurse in the Alexandra hospital saw the wounded arrive in waves, not from heroic stands, but from routes, from retreats, from units that had simply disintegrated under pressure. In the Chinese quarter, civilians who had believed British promises of protection now packed whatever they could carry and ran. The myth wasn't just dying, it was already dead. They just hadn't announced it yet. On the morning of February 15th, Percival called his final staff meeting. He presented 3 options. 1. Immediate counterattack to recapture the reservoirs. 2. Withdraw all forces to a tight perimeter around the city and fight house to house. 3. Surrender. The room understood what he didn't say aloud. Option 1 required troops that didn't exist. Option 2 would turn Singapore into Stalingrad, except without water, without ammunition resupply, and with 1 million civilians trapped inside the kill zone. Option 3 was the only one that wouldn't end in total annihilation. At 5:15 p.m., Percival walked into the Ford factory in Bukit Timah. General Yamashita sat across from him. The meeting lasted an hour. Yamashita, who had been bluffing with his own supply shortages and exhausted troops, demanded immediate unconditional surrender. Percival tried to negotiate terms. Yamashita pointed at his watch and said one word in English. Yes or no? Percival signed. 80,000 men. British, Australian, Indian. The largest surrender in the history of the British Army. Not might be lost. Was lost. And every strategist in London knew what it meant. If Singapore could fall, anything could fall. The collapse of Singapore wasn't an accident. It was structural. The fortress had been designed in the 1920s and 30s, a time when British naval supremacy was unquestioned. The entire defensive philosophy rested on one assumption: threats come from the sea. So they built coastal guns, 15-inch barrels pointing toward the horizon, ammunition stockpiles filled with armor-piercing shells meant for battleships, fire arcs calculated for targets 5, 10, 15 miles offshore. No one seriously planned for an enemy that would come through 600 miles of jungle, because it was considered impossible. The logistics said so. British staff studies calculated that moving a modern army through Malayan jungle required roads, railways, supply depots, fuel dumps. The Japanese would need months to establish supply lines. Their advance would stall. Attrition would destroy them before they reached Singapore. But the Japanese didn't fight like a modern European army. They traveled light. Bicycles instead of trucks, captured British supplies instead of their own depots. They moved faster because they carried less. When vehicles broke down, they abandoned them. Speed was the strategy. While British commanders waited for intelligence reports to confirm Japanese positions, the Japanese were already behind them. The command structure ensured it. Singapore's defense was divided between multiple authorities. The Army controlled land forces. The Navy controlled the coast. The RAF controlled what few planes remained. Civil administration controlled resources and infrastructure. No single commander had authority over everything. When the Japanese landed on the northwest coast, it took hours for various headquarters to even confirm the reports. Coordinating a counterattack required consensus between branches that didn't trust each other's intelligence. By the time orders were issued, the Japanese had already consolidated their beachhead. The training betrayed them. Most British and Commonwealth troops in Singapore had been trained for European-style warfare. Set-piece battles, clear front lines, defensive positions with fields of fire. The Japanese fought differently. They infiltrated at night. They bypassed strong points. They attacked from unexpected directions. They screamed, banged drums, created chaos. British doctrine said, hold the line, wait for reinforcements, maintain communication. Japanese doctrine said, break the line, create panic, keep moving. When Indian and Australian units found themselves surrounded, cut off from supply and command, many broke. Not because they lacked courage, because their training never prepared them for this kind of war. The imperial psychology completed it. For generations, British officers had been taught that discipline, organization, and European military science guaranteed superiority over Asian armies. The Japanese weren't supposed to be this good. Their equipment was second-rate. Their industrial base was smaller. Their pilots were rumored to have poor eyesight. Their soldiers were small, malnourished. These weren't assessments. They were assumptions built on racial hierarchy. When those assumptions met reality, the cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. Officers who might have adapted, who might have learned from early defeats, kept waiting for the Japanese to behave like Europeans. They never did. By February 15th, the mechanism was clear. Singapore fell because it was designed to fight the wrong war, with the wrong tactics, based on the wrong assumptions about the enemy. The fortress was a monument to strategic blindness, and 80,000 men paid the price for it. But the real cost wasn't measured in prisoners. It was measured in belief. The news reached London on February 16th. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. He was right. But the disaster wasn't just military. It was psychological. For 2 centuries, the British Empire had been built on a single premise: that British arms, British organization, British will were superior. The colonial subjects needed protection only Britain could provide. That the Royal Navy and the Union Jack guaranteed security from Suez to Singapore. In 7 days, that premise shattered. If Britain couldn't defend Singapore, a fortress 2 decades in the making, garrisoned by 80,000 troops, what could it defend? India watched. Burma watched. Australia and New Zealand watched. And they all asked the same question: can Britain protect us? The answer was becoming clear. No, not alone. In Tokyo, the victory was celebrated as proof of Japanese supremacy. Newsreels showed Percival signing the surrender. Propaganda posters declared the end of white colonialism in Asia. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan's vision of an empire free from Western control, suddenly seemed possible. Singapore's fall accelerated Japanese advances across the Pacific. Burma, the Philippines, New Guinea. Every victory fed the belief that the West was weak, decadent, defeatable. It would take 3 more years and 2 atomic bombs to prove otherwise. For the prisoners, the war had just begun. 80,000 men marched into captivity. They would build the Burma Railway, work in mines, endure starvation, disease, brutality. More than a quarter would never come home. And in military academies from Sandhurst to West Point, officers studied what went wrong. The lessons were written in blood. Assumptions are not intelligence. Fortifications are not strategy. Superiority is not guaranteed by race or history, and enemies who don't follow your rules aren't inferior. They're dangerous. Singapore fell because Britain prepared for the last war, not the next one. Because planners built defenses against threats they understood, not threats that existed. Because confidence became complacency, and complacency became catastrophe. In war, even the strongest fortress can become a trap. When you build walls facing the wrong direction, you don't see the enemy coming until it's too late.